Hello, guys. As we finish our World War II unit, we only have 3 breakdown videos left to go. So today we are going to talk about the battlefronts during World War II. So the fighting of World War II took place in 2 different areas. These are referred to as the theaters of operations. We have the first theater of operation in the Pacific, where Japanese forces reached the height of their power in 1942, occupying islands throughout the western Pacific Ocean. On the other side of the world, in Europe, much of the fighting in the first year was between the Germans and the Soviets, as the latter fought desperately to preserve the conquest of Russia. So we are going to break this lecture down in 2 parts: the fighting Germany and fighting Japan, because the U.S. Used 2 different strategies as we went about fighting this war. So, fighting Germany. The high tide of German advance ended in 1942, partly as a reason of U.S. entry into the war, but mainly because of a Soviet victory in Stalingrad in the winter of that year. Coordinating their military strategy, the British and Americans concentrated on 2 objectives in 1942: overcoming the menace of German submarines in the Atlantic and beginning bombing raids on German cities. So this strategy was known as defense at sea, attack by air. The protracted naval war to control the shipping lanes was known as the Battle of the Atlantic. German submarines sank over 500 Allied ships in 1942. Gradually, however, the Allies developed ways of containing the submarine menace through the use of radar, sonar, and the bombing of German air raids. So they were bombing everything in sight via bombs in the air, dropping bombs in the air, and defending the waterways and shipping canals and all of that. The U.S. bombers carried out daylight strategic bombing raids on military targets in Europe, but the lines between military and civilian targets became blurred as the war carried on, especially in Japan. Now, this was the textbook nicely saying that, unfortunately, as the war progressed, people like the U.S. who's dropping bombs bombed some civilian targets. The Allies had a daunting task of driving German occupying forces out of their advanced positions in North Africa and the Mediterranean, so they were hiding out. They began the North African campaign, Operation Torch, in November 1942, led by U.S. General Dwight Eisenhower and British General Bernard Montgomery. Allied forces succeeded in taking North Africa from the Germans by May 1943. So this was considered a win for the Allies. The next U.S.-British target was the Mediterranean island of Sicily, which they occupied in the summer of 1943, preparatory to an invasion in Italy. Mussolini fell from power during the summer, but Hitler forces rescued him and gave him nominal control of northern Italy. In fact, German troops controlled much of Italy at the time that the Allies invaded the peninsula in September 1943. The Germans put up a determined resistance to the Allied offensive, holding much of northern Italy until their final surrender in May of 1945. So, very interesting. We were able to push towards the German-occupied countries, the German-occupied lines, and make them surrender and take back control of those two pieces of land. From D-Day to victory in Europe, the Allied drive to liberate France began on June 6, 1944, with the largest invasion by sea in history. On D-Day, as the invasion date was called, so D-Day was invasion date. So when people talk about D-Day, they are talking about right here. So on that day, British, Canadian, and U.S. forces under the command of General Eisenhower secured several beachheads on the Normandy coast. After this bloody but successful attack, the Allied offensive moved rapidly to roll back German occupying forces. By the end of August, Paris was liberated. Liberated means free from German control. By September, Allied troops had crossed the German border to make a final push towards Berlin. The Germans launched a desperate counterattack in Belgium in December 1944 in the Battle of the Bulge. After this setback, however, Americans reorganized and resumed their attack. So they were pushing from the shores of Normandy. They were trying and pushing their hardest towards Berlin, which was considered the base of operations for the Germans at that time. German surrender and the discovery of the Holocaust. Since 1942, Allied bombing raids over Germany had reduced that nation's industrial capacity and ability to continue fighting. Recognizing that the end of the war was near as the Russian army closed in on Berlin, Hitler committed suicide on April 30th, 1945. The unconditional surrender of the Nazi armies took place a week later on May 7th. So that's how Germany surrendered to the Allied powers of Hitler committing suicide, and then a week later, Nazi armies committing a full surrender. As U.S., this is a pretty shocking paragraph in the textbook. As the U.S. troops advanced through Germany, they came upon German concentration camps and witnessed the horrifying event of the Nazis' program of genocide against the Jews and others. Americans and the world were shocked to learn that 6 million Jewish civilians and several million non-Jews had been systematically murdered by Nazi Germany. So, the Holocaust. Many of you guys know the Holocaust. Education has been teaching you about the Holocaust for many years, and you guys even read Night as part of high school curriculum in most, not most, if all schools. So the Holocaust was a dark day. Was a dark path in the history of the world. As we go into fighting Japan, there are also another dark day in the war. But this was shocking to the world and to Americans especially when they discovered the depths of the Holocaust movement by Nazi Germany. So we are gonna transition to fighting Japan. In Europe, British, Soviet, and U.S. forces was jointly responsible for defeating Germany. But in the Pacific, it was largely the U.S. armed forces that challenged the Japanese. After the Pearl Harbor attack, Japan seized control of much of East Asia and Southeast Asia. By early 1942, Japanese troops occupied Korea, eastern China, the Philippines, British Burma, and Malaya, French Indochina, the Dutch East Indies, and most of the Pacific Islands west of Midway Islands. So that is critical for you to know. Japan occupied tons of islands. If you look at the map of the Pacific between Japan and the U.S., Hawaii, or the U.S. mainland, you'll see a bunch of islands. And right in the middle of that chain is the Midway Islands. And Japan occupied all the islands from Japan to Midway Island. You'll see why that's important later on. Actually, you'll see why that's important right now. Turning point, 1942. The war in the Pacific was dominated by naval forces battling over a vast area. Intercepting and decoding Japanese messages enabled U.S. forces to destroy 4 Japanese carriers and 300 planes in the decisive Battle of Midway on June 4th through the 7th. This battle ended Japanese expansion. So we saw Japan starting to starting to expand and take over islands. So the Marines especially, stopped in the decisive battle of Midway that lasted 3 to 4 days, guys. So it was a quick win for America. Island hopping campaign. After the victory at Midway, the United States began a long campaign to get within striking distance of Japan's home islands by seizing strategic locations in the Pacific. Using a strategy called island hopping, commanders bypassed strongly held Japanese posts and isolated them with naval and air power. Allied forces moved steadily towards Japan. So we were adamant of jumping islands to get closer and closer to the mainland of Japan to launch our offensive strike. So let's talk about some major battles. Early in 1942, the Japanese had conquered the Philippines. When General Douglas MacArthur, the commander of Army units in the Southern Pacific, was driven from the islands, he famously vowed, "I shall return." The conflict that prepared the way for U.S. reoccupation of the Philippines was the largest naval battle in history. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the Japanese Navy was virtually destroyed. For the first time in the war, the Japanese used kamikaze pilots to make suicide attacks on U.S. ships. Kamikazes often inflicted major damage in the colossal Battle of Okinawa, April to June 1945, before finally succeeding in taking this island and near Japan. U.S. forces suffered 50,000 casualties and killed 100,000 Japanese. So we did it. We got as close to Japan's mainland as we'll get. Let's see what happens. And this is, to many, a dark day of a presidency. The power that it had really defined the moment. The atomic bombs. After Okinawa, a huge invasion force stood ready to attack Japan. Extremely heavy casualties were feared. By this time, however, the United States had developed a frightfully destructive new weapon. So, before we continue, land attack by Americans. People feared that we would lose a whole bunch of casualties if we did a land attack towards the Japanese. The top-secret Manhattan Project had begun in 1942, directed by the physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer. The project employed over 100,000 people and spent $2 billion to develop a weapon whose powers came from splitting of the atom. The atomic bomb, or A-bomb, was successfully tested on July 16th, 1945 in New Mexico. This is why presidents have gray hairs after they leave office. The new president, Harry Truman, and his wartime allies called on Japan to surrender unconditionally, or face utter destruction. When Japan gave an unsatisfactory reply, Truman consulted with his advisors and decided to use the new weapon on 2 Japanese cities. On August 6th, an A-bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, and on August 9th, a second bomb was dropped near Nagasaki. About 250,000 Japanese died, either immediately or after prolonged periods of suffering as a result of the 2 bombs. We have not used the atomic bomb. Any country has not used the atomic bomb since this event. Because since this event, the United States, Russia, North Korea, all have developed, and a bunch of other countries all have developed some kind of nuclear warhead. And we fear if we do get in a position to launch a nuke or a bomb or an atomic bomb or whatever you call it, it would be utter destruction for everybody in the world. So, Japan surrenders. Within a week after the second bomb fell, Japan agreed to surrender if the Allies would allow the Emperor to remain as the powerless head of state. General MacArthur received Japan's formal surrender on September 2nd, 1945 in Tokyo Harbor aboard the battleship Missouri. So Japan surrendered. And that was how we fought and won in both Germany and Japan. Alrighty guys, I'll talk to you guys in the next video lecture.